It is the late 1820s, and the bend in the St. Joseph River is no longer a secret. For just a few years, this slice of northern Indiana had belonged to a handful of fur traders and the Potawatomi communities who had been here for generations before them. It was quiet and remote, known mostly to the people who needed to know it. But by the end of the 1820s, the land surveys are complete. The public lands are open for purchase. The settlers are eager to buy. They are coming to farm. They are coming to trade. They're coming to build. Some of them even come to build towns of their own right here on the bend of the river. There are going to be more of those towns than you think. Somewhere along this particular stretch of the river, one of those towns is going to become a city. The question is which one? There are, at this particular moment in the late 1820s, at least two places along the St. Joseph River that might have a reasonable claim on that future. They are very different from each other. One of them exists. One of them does not. The one that doesn't exist is the village of St. Joseph. It has been officially designated as the seat of the county's government. It sits on the farm of a man named William Brookfield. It has a name. It has official papers. It has commissioners who point to it on a map and say, yes, that is where the county seat will be. What it does not have is buildings or residents or any meaningful evidence that anyone intends to change that situation. The village of St. Joseph is a sheet of paper with ambition. And then there is the place at the bend in the river. It doesn't have a proper name yet. Alexis Coquillard called his trading post Big St. Joseph Station. Lathrop Taylor's account books say St. Joseph's, Indiana. The settlers who live nearby have taken to calling it the Bend, or sometimes South Bend, on account of where it sits on the river. Depending on who you ask and when you ask them, it goes by at least 4 different names, none of them official, all of them pointing at the same spot. But by the late 1820s, it has people. Sort of a lot of people. It has commerce and momentum. Most importantly, it has 2 men who arrived here as fur traders and are beginning to understand that what they've actually been building this whole time is a town. They just need to figure out what to call it. Hello and welcome to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum in South Bend. I'm your host, Aaron Helman, and during this series, we're exploring the earliest years of South Bend, long before it was incorporated as a city, long before the Civil War, back in the earliest years when it was just a few pioneers scratching out a living. During the course of this episode, you'll hear fictional advertisements for very real historical companies and products. We do that to help break up the podcast, provide some levity, to include just a little more history than we could otherwise, and to give you a sense of the time and place when and where all of this is happening. The absence of actual paid advertisements is made possible by the generosity of our sponsors and donors. One more disclaimer. In order to make things a little easier, I am going to refer to the area as South Bend for the duration of the episode, even though we will be discussing some history that predates the city and predates the South Bend name. And now, with all that out of the way, let's watch South Bend become a real, actual town. It's a story that's going to start with a road. A long road. The fur trade that built the region was dying. Coquillard and Taylor could feel it in their thinning margins. They saw it with the dwindling numbers of beaver pelts coming off the river each season. They knew it in their ledgers. The international economy that made this particular bend in the river valuable was coming apart at the seams. 10 years earlier, there were 100 reasons to put a town at South Bend, but the town was barely on its way by the time those reasons began to vanish. That raised an uncomfortable question. If people didn't need furs anymore, and if they didn't need a portage, did they need South Bend at all? Did they need Coquillard and Taylor's town sitting at a bend in a river in the middle of the Indiana wilderness, close to nothing and far from everything? It turns out the answer was yes. In 1826, the Indiana State Legislature commissioned the construction of a road, and not just any road. This road would be Indiana's first great north-south highway, designed to connect the Ohio River at Madison all the way to the shores of Lake Michigan, running up through the center of Indianapolis and into the wilderness of the northern part of the state. It would carry settlers, supplies, mail, and commerce. They called it the Michigan Road, and Judge Howard said that the Michigan Road was to Indiana what the Erie Canal was to New York, what the Union Pacific was to the Rockies, and what the old Roman roads were to faraway ancient provinces. The plan for the Michigan Road was straightforward. Start at Madison on the Ohio River, come up through Indianapolis, the new state capital, head north, bear west, hit Lake Michigan. But there was a problem. The Grand Kankakee Marsh was, at that time, one of the largest native wetlands in North America. It stretched from just south of South Bend all the way into Illinois, more than 500,000 acres of standing water, saturated prairie, and impenetrable bog. The Kankakee River itself followed 250 miles of bends and oxbows, but only covered about 90 linear miles of actual distance because it refused to go anywhere in a straight line. The slope of the land was barely 5 inches per mile, which meant water had nowhere to drain, so it simply spread across the landscape and stayed there. A newspaper editor wrote that the marsh was an impassable barrier, only equaled by the famous Dismal Swamp of Virginia. The governor sent a team north from Indianapolis in the spring of 1828, tasked with finding the most direct route to Lake Michigan. They made it as far as the Kankakee before the swamp made its position clear. The surveyors reported back to the legislature that it would be impossible to build a road through the marsh. Not in 1828. Not for another 70 years until engineers dredged and ditched the marsh into submission in the late 19th century, which meant the road was going to have to go around it. The choice was not without controversy. Indiana Governor James Brown Ray preferred the direct route. The direct route was, after all, about 102 miles shorter. But every person who had actually tried to travel through the Kankakee confirmed the same thing. The longer route was the only practical choice. The road would have to go from Logansport north to the bend in the river, and then west toward Lake Michigan. It couldn't have happened too soon. Commerce was finding new lines, and the fur trade routes were becoming overfilled with dust and leaves and grass. The Michigan Road was the new line, and it was coming through South Bend. South Bend had been built on a portage. It was about to sit on a highway.
Attention, South Benders. Calvin Lilly, proprietor of the South Bend Inn, has paid handsomely to deliver this message. I wish the person who borrowed my saddle would be so obliging as to return it, as I should like to have the use of it a while myself. That is all. And now back to A Bend in Time, presented by the History Museum.
When the Michigan Road Survey team reached the bend in the St. Joseph River in 1828, one of them paused over his field notes and wrote something that had nothing to do with survey measurements. At this point, he wrote, is a beautiful site for a town. Coquillard and Taylor had already figured that out. The fur trade was winding down. The road was coming. The settlers were already arriving. What this place needed now was not another trading post. It needed infrastructure. It needed streets with names. If it wanted the federal government to take notice, it needed a post office. In 1829, Lathrop Taylor applied for one. The post office was approved on June 6, 1829. Taylor was appointed as the first postmaster of the new settlement. As for the first post office, it was smaller and less impressive than you think. A wooden case with a few rows of pigeonholes and a large space at the bottom. That was it, and if you want to, you can go see it at the History Museum. That original post office is in the museum's permanent collection. But before Taylor could sort a single letter into those pigeonholes, someone had to decide what to put on the outside of the case. Someone had to give this place a name. If you wanted to send a letter to Alexis Coquillard, where was it you would say he lived? They had options. Alexis Coquillard had been calling his trading post Big St. Joseph Station since 1823. Taylor's own account books used St. Joseph's, Indiana. The settlers who lived nearby had taken to calling it the Bend or sometimes South Bend on account of its place on the river. 4 names, all pointing at the same spot, all of them reasonable, most of them obvious, and in the end they chose none of them. On June 6, 1829, the United States Post Office designated the new settlement as Southold, Indiana. Southold. Where did they get that name from? Your guess is as good as mine. Judge Howard hadn't figured it out by the time he wrote his history of St. Joseph County in 1907, and I haven't figured it out either. Whatever it was, this was Southold, and so, for the next few minutes at least, I guess this podcast is called A Hold in Time. It's a bad name. Coquillard and Taylor set to the work of building their town, whatever its name was. They started moving fast. For years, they had been living and working on land they didn't technically own. Nobody in the county did because the federal government hadn't surveyed it yet, and you couldn't buy what hadn't been measured. But by 1830, the surveyors had done their work, the land office was open, and for the first time, a man could walk up to a government counter, point to a piece of northern Indiana on a map, pay his money, and walk out with a legal claim to it. Just like it had been when they were traders rushing to exploit the portage, the spoils usually went to the men who got there first. This time, it was Taylor who got there first. On October 4th, 1830, he bought the south half of a quarter section of land at the bend in the river. 3 weeks later, on October 25th, Coquillard bought the north half of the same piece. It was the land that would become their town. On March 28, 1831, they drew streets onto a map, streets wider than they needed to be because they were already planning for growth. They drew lines and divided the land into lots for resale. They donated parcels to set aside space for a courthouse, a school, and a cemetery. This was what it took to start a town. You drew it into existence on paper, and then you built it. The streets they drew that day are still there, and all that was left to do was to settle in on a permanent name. This time, they got it right. South Bend, Indiana. But South Bend wasn't the only settlement with ambitions springing up along the bend in the St. Joseph River. There were others purchasing land and others planning towns all their own. The question of which of those towns would become the dominant one was still very much wide open.
The state of Indiana is pleased to announce the sale of lands in northern Indiana along the Michigan Road. Hundreds of lots are coming available, but they won't last long. Visit your land office and choose your new home today. And now, back to A Hold in Time.
Really? You're making me say that?
Presented by the History Museum.
St. Joseph County was organized on January 29, 1830, and it came into the world not entirely certain what it was going to be. Someone had to be in charge of it. Someone had to collect the taxes and record the deeds and hold the courts and keep the peace. And whoever did all of that would do it from the county seat, the town that would get the courthouse, the county officials, and the accumulated weight of governmental authority. In a region full of settlements jostling for position, the county seat was the prize. It was the thing that would make one town matter more than the rest. Coquillard and Taylor wanted it, but they weren't the only ones. The appointed commissioners had designated the seat at a place called St. Joseph, a theoretical town on William Brookfield's farm about 2 miles down the river from the bend. The only problem was that there was no town on William Brookfield's farm about 2 miles down the river from the bend. but St. Joseph at least had a formal legal plat filed even before South Bend did. So the state bureaucrats did what state bureaucrats do. They tracked down the oldest and most official-looking piece of paper they could find, and they voted for that one. That's how St. Joseph County's first official county seat ended up at an imaginary town on an out-of-the-way farmstead. Fortunately, it was a problem the people would be able to fix for themselves once they got their own county government up and running. As part of their earliest business, they would get to choose to relocate their county seat if they wanted to. Just one problem. Without a real county seat, where were they going to discuss that business? Answer: in Alexis Coquillard's living room. That meant that the county seat was one place on paper and another in practice. It was something that needed to be changed. That's why 128 residents of St. Joseph County signed a petition calling for the county seat to be relocated to South Bend. That doesn't sound like a lot of people, but in a county that had barely existed for a year, in a region that had been wilderness a decade earlier, it was very nearly everyone. 5 commissioners were named to consider the question, and then, on May 12, 1831, before the commissioners had even made their decision, Coquillard and Taylor made their case in the most direct language available to ambitious men on the Indiana frontier. They showed up with a bond. The document they signed that day committed them to paying $3,000 to guarantee that the county seat would be permanently located at South Bend. They also agreed to donate 15 specific lots for public use. The other aspiring towns that desired to become the seat didn't have much of an argument over South Bend. They also didn't have $3,000. On September 7, 1831, the county government started making decisions. First, they set the bounty for wolf scalps at 75 cents for adults and 37.5 cents for pups. Then, they moved the county seat to South Bend. South Bend was off and running, and it's never really looked back. Hey, thanks for joining us on A Bend in Time presented by the History Museum in South Bend. There's more history waiting for you at historymuseumsb.org. I'm your host, Aaron Helman. The theme music is Whose Distance Is It Anyway by Neil Carmichael. In our next episode, we're looking at the 1831 census in South Bend, and we're going to catch up with a few families that you might not be familiar with. Until then, keep learning new things, and remember, everything is fascinating as long as you stay curious.